Senator Hawley joins us now, first on CNBC. Senator, nice to have you. How are you going to go about forcing big tech to actually put a price on that data?
Well, the law requires the SEC to develop a valuation formula. And then big tech, it's not that they don't have a price for the data. They know how much the data is worth to them. Their whole business model is based on it. It's based on taking our data, not telling us, selling it without our consent, and turning a profit. So what our bill says is tell the consumer what their data is worth and then give every consumer the right to get that data back.
Do you think consumers who use these platforms willingly, and many of whom know that, in fact, their data is being used, that's the price they're paying, really care?
Oh, I don't think that the consumers do know that their data is being used, certainly not the extent of the data. I mean, Facebook and Google, they hold out their platforms to the consumer as being free. But of course, it's not free. What we're paying with it for is our data. And we want consumers to know that, and then we want to give them the power to know exactly what that data is worth, and then to say no. And I've also introduced legislation that would allow every consumer to opt out of being tracked, to opt out of having to share their data with big tech.
Senator Hawley, this legislation would focus on, quote, commercial data operators, and those are defined as services with over 100 million monthly users. A lot of the media focus and discussion has been around social media companies, but arguably, depending on what the specifics of those guidelines entail, I mean, it could be other companies like Airbnb and Spotify and others that could be affected by this as well. How wide is the net that you're looking to cast in terms of these regulations and who they apply to?
Well, it's wide. I mean, if it's over 100 million users, I mean, it is a significant net. And by the way, it also encompasses data brokers. I mean, these are often companies that are in the shadows, that no one's really sure what they do. We don't know where our data goes once companies sell these profiles to the data brokers. So they're covered by our bill. They, too, if they have significant data, have to give a valuation to consumers. And they, too, have to delete the data if consumers say, I want my information back.
Senator, there's a difference between a raw ingredient, a recipe, and the chef who knows how to make the amazing meal. And my question is, data's the raw ingredient here. The biggest internet companies know how to turn that into a very profitable enterprise for themselves. What if the data itself, my data in isolation, isn't worth that much unless you've got the algorithms and the know-how on top of it?
Well, then the big tech companies should have no problem in disclosing the valuation. I would think that they would be very eager to then say, well, here's what it's...
Are you okay with that outcome?
What I'm okay with is giving consumers more information and giving them control. And that's why an important aspect of this legislation is the right to delete. It's the eraser button, if you like. It's the right for consumers to say, I want all my data back. Whatever it's worth to the company, I want it back. I just don't want them having it. And under our legislation, the companies would have to give it back. They'd have to delete it. And I think that's important.
Senator, why would the regulatory oversight of this go to the SEC?
That's a natural agency, I think, that has the ability quantitatively to help develop the valuation methodologies and to be able to effectively enforce this. We need to have effective enforcement. We can't rely on self-reporting. We can't rely on the good faith efforts of the big tech companies. There's not a lot of good faith there. So we need real teeth, and this bill has it.
And is the intent here to eventually get to a point where consumers are empowered to demand or get some kind of a payment back from the social networks and others for the use of their data?
Well, I mean, I think that this is a step towards giving consumers control over their own property. Data is property, and this says that consumers ought to be informed what it's worth, and they ought to be able to get it back. And as I say, I have companion legislation that would also say in the first instance, consumers should be able to opt out of being tracked, opt out of giving it in the first place. So I really think it's about consumer control and consumer empowerment.
You've also introduced another bill that targets Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. It seems designed to fight against what I guess you believe is more discrimination against conservative voices on these platforms. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Censorship. I mean, viewpoint censorship. I'm a constitutional lawyer. What we say in the First Amendment context is that speech censorship that targets speech for disfavor is called viewpoint censorship. These companies, the biggest companies, the big tech companies, get a special immunity from government under Section 230. And my view is that they shouldn't use that to censor political speech. Now, if they want to do that, then they shouldn't get the special handout from government. It's a trade-off.
Right, but one of the key criticisms is, though, they don't police their platforms nearly enough, whether it's YouTube or Twitter or Facebook. And in fact, they should be held to the same standard that we are in some way, making sure that we actually spend the money to make sure that what is said is correct, and that viewpoints that are far outside the norm are not necessarily things that are shared widely.
And that's certainly one option. I mean, we could just repeal Section 230 and we could treat these tech companies like every other platform or publisher, the way that your outlet is treated, the way that media companies are treated, and journalistic platforms. So we could do that. What I propose is a middle ground that says that these big tech companies can still get their special immunity, and they can still moderate content, by the way. They can still get rid of violent language. They can still get rid of stuff that incites violence, all of that, but they cannot engage in political censorship on either side, on any side.
Senator, I just want to get your thoughts on everything that's going on with China right now. I know you've said just recently that you see us as in a technological arms race with China. Our own Kayla Tausche has been reporting that one of the asks from China ahead of these trade talks this weekend at the G20 is that the Huawei ban be reversed. Meantime, we've got the National Defense Authorization Act, that legislation moving through the two houses of Congress right now. How likely is it that Huawei is not seen as a national security threat in the future?
I think it's highly unlikely that they won't be a national security threat. I mean, Huawei is a significant national security threat. I would be opposed to anything that opens the door to Huawei in this country. I think that the administration has done thus far is absolutely right as it relates to Huawei. I mean, look, they have built, we know that the distance between Huawei and the Chinese military is non-existent. I mean, they are essentially the same entity functionally. We cannot afford the security risk of having Huawei embedded in our networks, embedded in our data platforms, and we've got to take a tough stand on it.